I see myself here not as a lecturer, but as a guest uh, initiator of an open forum where I will be the one to ask. So I have prepared questions, but every question, of course, has a background. And I prefer to do it this way because I know you have more knowledge, and I think my role here is to open the space for collective and communal thinking, or probably rethinking, of how the Lumads are positioning themselves in relation to the Bangsamoro struggle in their search for peace in Mindanao. And so maybe the first thing is my own location. I was born in Mindanao, at the foot of Mount Kitanglad. But when I was 9 months old, we moved to Bulacan, and I grew up as a Tagalog. But my mission as a Jesuit brought me back to Mindanao, and I heard a voice at the foot of Mount Kitanglad when I was about to be ordained. Sabi ng boses, dinhi ka. I don't know if you believe in that, but I heard the voice coming from the ground saying, you should be here, stay here, work here, and probably die here. I have to locate myself in relation to Mindanao that way, because I would like also to invite you to locate yourself. Are you born here? Were you born here? Do you plan to die here? Did you get married here? Do you have friends who were killed here? Did you have to bury your relatives here? Have you seen blood here? Have you seen flowers here? Have you climbed Mount Apo? You must have some connection with Mindanao. And therefore, you must have some connection with the peoples of Mindanao, and in this particular case, the indigenous peoples, the Lumads. The first point which we might want to pick up is this. Do you think that the Lumads' assertion of their self-determination is just a riding on the Bangsamoro struggle? What is our honest view of this? Do we sincerely believe that the indigenous peoples have sufficiently expressed their assertion of self-determination? Or do we support the idea that, you know, the indigenous peoples, they cannot fight for themselves, they just ride on the peace process between the government and the Bangsamoro, the Moro, or the National Democrats fighting the government? And then they just try to insert, because they cannot wage a whole massive political mobilization, and therefore they would ask for some coins in the wealth sharing annex and the power sharing thing, because they don't have their own big struggle to really defend their own cause. My own personal view is that the indigenous peoples, the Lumads, have been expressing their own ways in various ways, even going up to a higher place is a strategy. It is an expression of assertion, a peaceful assertion, trying to avoid bloody encounters, etc. So, but I think we need to clarify that. Do we recognize the moves, no matter how salient and silent their expressions may be, that all these years, through some manifestos here, through some bonfires, through some rituals and symbols, through clarification of some traditional boundaries, the Lumads have been asserting their own indigenous identities, political structure in their own way. And therefore, we must have a different way of measuring the effectivity of their own assertion. In all our discussions, we should be mindful that we cannot just talk about Lumads and be thinking about Central Mindanao Lumads only. Ganyan. We cannot presuppose that the indigenous peoples in the island provinces are already okay, or their status is already given, and we should just be talking about the areas that will be covered by the extensions northward to Lanao and even in Cotabato. So more and more, I get a feel that even as we realize with some Buanga seeds that the MNLF is still not a spent force, we also have to recognize that there are also IPs in the island provinces and in some areas, even in central Mindanao. And therefore, we have to expand the semantic content of the terms that we are using. Next to that is the view from within. Some leaders of the indigenous peoples have been privileged enough to be included in the formal peace negotiations. Now, maybe we can ask those among us, the Lumads who have been privileged enough to work within the formal peace negotiation, what would be our experience? The latest, of course, would be Froilin. What's the nickname of Froilin? Tutut. It's a Tutut. Tutut has written short but very powerful, very touching paragraphs on what she sees from the inside. And yes, she is within a member of the Bangsamoro Transition Commission. I would like to pick up one point raised by Froilin, by Tutut. She said that when the Bangsamoro Transition Commission discusses power sharing and wealth sharing, the territory, the land, the ancestral domain, they seem to discuss the resources and how the resources will be shared, whether it's 75-25 in favor of the national government. And Froilin misses the discussion on ancestral domain as Mother Earth. And so I felt that, Tutut was bringing in an indigenous sensitivity to the understanding of ancestral domain, which apparently is missing in the annex of the power sharing and probably in wealth sharing as well. The other point I'd like to invite you to reflect on would be the strategic and legislative intervention. Now, after the peace, the framework agreement has been drafted, the next documents that will be produced will be the annexes, and then the formulation of the draft of the Bangsamoro Basic Law, which will be submitted to Congress. It will be rehashed for ratification through plebiscite. Now, this is a very technical procedure. Where are the critical points in this whole process? And how can the Lumads enter into that process? Into the drafting of the annexes, into the drafting of the Bangsamoro Basic Law, in the submission to Congress. Do we have enough Lumads or IPs to defend or to question the Bangsamoro Basic Law draft in Congress? And do we have enough resources for campaigning for the Lumads' decision or judgment on the draft Bangsamoro Basic Law, whichever way, whether to promote it, to campaign for it, or to raise some questions? So what could be the Lumad strategies? And who could be their champions? Do we have IP champions in the Senate? Do we have IP champions in Congress, in the media? Can we invite, for example, Grace Poe to be the Lumad champion? Or is it going to be Lauren Legarda? Now, I'd like to introduce another angle here. Now, if we take this whole peace process from the perspective of the Lumads, then we will realize that the Lumads are facing not just the Moro issue, but also the communists, the NPAs. And so maybe from the perspectives of the Lumads, we may have to compare the peace processes between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, plus the MNLF. And on the other side, especially eastern, northern, and southern Mindanao, between the government and the National Democratic Front, with other variations like the RPM, ABB, Alex Bongkayo Brigade. No? What would be the difference of the experiences of the Lumads in their dealing with the two armed conflicts and the two peace processes? I am part of the government team that drafted the socio-economic reform agenda of the government that we would like to propose to the National Democratic Front. When we went to Oslo 2 years ago, we presented our framework. The framework, coming from the government, was composed of 6 chapters. And the National Democratic Front was surprised that in the 6 chapters, 1 chapter was on indigenous peoples and another chapter was on environment. If you look at the framework of the National Democratic Front, the IPs were mentioned in the small section of the marginalized sectors. Now, it looks like on the draft, it looks like the Lumads have better representation in the government proposal to the National Democratic Front. I don't see it happening in the government framework in dealing with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So what is happening here? Now, if we are rethinking the whole peace strategy of the Lumads as they confront both, the two multi-front armed conflicts and multifaceted peace processes, how would the Lumads improve or rethink their strategy for searching peace in Mindanao? Given this situation, I'd like to throw an idea, and this is it. It seems so pathetic that the Lumads are trying to get some coins in the whole government negotiation with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the government negotiation with the National Democratic Front. What if we take IPRA itself as the signed peace agreement? What if we consider that actually the Lumads do not have to bother with this barya that they can get from these two peace processes, but assert that, like the MNLF, they already have IPRA, that the IPRA is equivalent to the MNLF final peace agreement. It's just that IPRA has not been seen as a peace agreement, and it has not been really taken seriously for implementation. You know, I got this idea when I reviewed the response of the Supreme Court when several quarters challenged the constitutionality of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. And the argument was that the IPRA was too much of an affirmative action, too much giving way to the indigenous peoples. And the response of the Supreme Court was, what do you expect? This document is meant to correct historical injustice. Haven't we heard about correcting historical justice? That's right. That is in the discussion of the peace talks with the Bangsamoro. What they want is a document that will correct the historical injustice. But the Lumads already has a document. It talks about territory, it talks about rights, it talks about resources, it talks about representation, including the indigenous people's mandatory representation in local government, which is bigger than a simple representation as party list. My God, this is a peace agreement. If we assert that as our peace agreement, or as the Lumad peace agreement, and just bat for greater implementation? Now, of course, we will have some legal battles here. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe I'm stupid to be throwing this idea. But suppose the indigenous peoples are not mentioned at all in the wealth sharing, are not mentioned at all in the power sharing. Does that mean the indigenous peoples will have no representation in government? If we realize that IPRA is a national government, it should apply even to the autonomous region or Bangsamoro region somehow. And that IPRA says the indigenous peoples will have priority rights over the resources of their ancestral domain. Now, I'd like to throw this idea because right now, listening to the words of Tutut and looking at the direction of the provisions in Bangsamoro, I don't think we will get much. And much less in the National Democratic Front because the talks have been stalled. And so, shall we wait till we get some beautiful lines in the National Democratic Front peace agreement? Should we wait for the Bangsamoro Basic Law and try to search Lumad or IPs in the text? I don't know. Maybe there's another way because the indigenous peoples in the Philippines, I believe, already has a peace agreement, and this peace agreement has been achieved peacefully. Lastly, I think in all these things, we will need a more inclusive peace communication. Now, when we design peace consultation, peace communication, do we maximize this situation? Do we maximize the instrumentality of peace communication, consultation, to make sure that the indigenous groups, including the IPs in the island provinces, are sufficiently represented? Now, take note, that means adding a few more languages when we translate the English documents, but I think it's worth it. So now, if we do that, then we may need to go beyond just translating documents to their languages, but we may also need to tap the indigenous ways of communicating, indigenous ways of ritualizing agreements, indigenous ways of healing the land. And I think that would complete the process. So maybe I should stop there. I think I have given you a few things to discuss, and I'm sure you may have more ideas to throw into the group. And I really appreciate your listening quietly because of the camera. But I stand here now to be enriched by the sharing of the group. Thank you very much.